Welcome back, everybody, to the San Francisco Dharma Collective. This is our Sunday night Buddhism in translation little gathering. I'm MC Owens, and tonight, so I was trying to think of what to chat about tonight, and I came up with something, and then I just got a great question, and Robin, I just got your great question, so I'm going to sort of weave these ideas together. So, the main topic or the main thing that I had thought of talking about tonight was, in a way, like, what does it mean to be a Buddhist? Or like what makes somebody a Buddhist or not in that way? So that's sort of the main theme. But Robin asked a really important, very interesting question. Oh, sort of about the world, I would say. I'll clarify it a little bit later on. But I want to kind of save that for the end. It's a perfect thing to chat about. But before we get there, let me kind of mention it's it's both what we're going to talk about tonight, but it's also sort of like what this Sunday night Buddhism in translation group is sort of all about. In many ways, I meant to tell you all this weeks and weeks ago when we first sort of started this new format, and I just kept missing opportunities. So I'm going to start with it tonight. Um, this is something that I've mentioned in the distant past, but I don't feel like I've said it for a while. So I wanted to kind of like, because we're going to talk about like, what does it mean to be a Buddhist? I'm going to sort of talk a lot about myself tonight in terms of like, I consider myself a Buddhist, but why do I why do I consider myself that? What does that mean to me? So we're going to chat about that. But what I wanted to start with talking about was how, like, what is my interest in all of this? Well, as many of you know, I started off in the academic scholarly route of things, a very circuitous undergraduate traveling through philosophy departments and history departments until finally settling in a religion department. And then I started studying Buddhism. So this was in undergraduate. And then I decided to go get a master's degree in Buddhist studies. And so I went to the University of Hawaii and I got my master's degree. And the main thing that I was looking at, the main thing that I was interested in was, well, first of all, I was studying Chinese Buddhism specifically, because I had been studying the Chinese language, but I was specifically interested in, and this is what I wrote my master's thesis on. I was specifically interested in the Tang Dynasty, the kind of high point of medieval Chinese culture. I was very interested in their adoption of this foreign religion called Buddhism. And by the way, everything I'm about to tell you is not my ideas. These are very well established ideas. But what I learned about was how, so you may know, if you don't, allow me to clarify, Buddhism sort of enters China or like the Chinese culture or what we today call China. Buddhism enters that culture kind of right around the year zero. It's like during the first century of the Common Era. And during the first, I would say, 100 or 200 years of Buddhism in China, it seems, and this is all based on archaeological evidence, but the interest in Buddhism seems to have been entirely iconographic. So we're talking about statuary, paintings, images, and things like that. Specifically, what I'm talking about is that it's during the first century of the Common Era that we start to find little Buddhas and Bodhisattvas being buried with people along with other gods, other indigenous Chinese gods, or things like that. So this was the first thing that started happening in China was just an interest, seemingly an interest in the visuals of Buddhism. Then you start to get the early period of translation. And during that early period of translating, the Chinese, they didn't know what they were really dealing with exactly. And so what you get is during, I'd say the 200s and the 300s, during those first few centuries of translations, you get a lot of like really, really, really rough translations of things. Like they're not super accurate. And in particular, the Chinese in those early centuries, they used a lot of Taoist terms. So a lot of indigenous, familiar ideas like the Tao, the way, and all kinds of other Taoist ideas were used to try to understand Buddhism. And then eventually, during the early days of the Tang Dynasty, actually, even a little bit before that, so the Tang Dynasty starts around the year 600. It's probably more like 500, 400 that you start to get like accurate translations of these Buddhist texts coming from India, coming from the Sanskrit language. And so it's during the sway that like before the Tang Dynasty that because the Chinese now have like accurate translations of all of this, now Buddhism can start entering the intelligentsia. So entering kind of the educated class, the philosopher class, the literary class. So during the Tang Dynasty in particular is when Buddhism really starts to become popular because it's being understood and it's kind of matching, if not surpassing, indigenous Chinese philosophy. Okay, now the thing that interested in me, and again, this was not my realization, but what was brought to my attention by my professors was that the history of Buddhism in America, in American culture, went through and is going through the exact same process. Whereas the very, very, very first like Buddhist influence on American culture was the classic little cross-legged Buddha image. This was before people even knew how to, what Buddhism was all about. There was the classic kind of East Asian image of the seated cross-legged Buddha figure. And sure enough, like even in the 1800s, you start to see those images coming over from Asia. And then, just like in Chinese culture, you get the early days of translation of Buddhist texts into English, but just like in China, those early translations into English, they were pretty rough and they were mostly being translated by Christian theologians. And so they were using a lot of Christian language, like the language of God, the language of salvation, all of that kind of Christian language. So the early, or like that first wave of translations of Buddhist text into English, they almost read like Christian, quasi-Christian scripture. just like in China, where early Buddhist translations read a little bit like Taoist texts. But then, of course, after the 60s into the basically the 1970s, that's when you start to get accurate, correct translations of Buddhist texts from Chinese, Japanese, Sanskrit, you name it. And so it's in the 70s that Buddhism starts to infiltrate the more kind of academic, again, the intelligentsia of the English speaking world. So, in other words, there's a very interesting parallel between the Chinese adoption of Buddhism from India and the American adoption of Buddhism from, well, Japan, Vietnam, China, Tibet, India, you name it. But again, the parallels are there. So, recognizing these parallels, I was very interested in studying how did the Chinese, like, I guess in particular, what my master's thesis was about. I was interested in what aspects of Buddhism did the Chinese not even bother with? And what aspects of Buddhism did they pull into their culture, basically saying, this is Buddhism in that way? So I was kind of interested in that. And in particular, what I was looking at was, well, I won't go into it in too much detail, but I was studying something known as the Qinggui. So Qinggui, Chanyuan Qinggui is the pure standards for Chan monasteries. So Chan, of course, is like Zen Buddhism, but the origins of Zen Buddhism are in China. And what happened is that in China, Chan, the Zen schools, they were known for something called these Qinggui, these pure standards. And what those were Chinese additions to the already existing Vinaya, to the already existing monastic standards that were coming from India. Well, the Chinese, they adopted the traditional Indian monastic system, but then they added on top of it another layer of rules that were sort of specific to Chinese culture in that way. So I was studying all of that. So I was studying the cultural adoption of Buddhism into China, but with an interest of eventually doing a kind of comparative study with what is presently going on in American culture. I never wound up doing that. I wound up being a part of American Buddhism in that way, in terms of being a teacher rather than studying it in that sense. So, okay, so that's a kind of quick background to like how I got into all of this. I eventually went off to a PhD program. I became a professor of religious studies, a professor mainly of Buddhism, but I eventually left and started to become a private Buddhist teacher in that way. So that's my quick kind of how I got here. And what I now want to talk about is it's this idea of what does it mean to be a Buddhist? And indeed, that's what I was looking at in China. Like, what did it mean to be a Buddhist in the Tang Dynasty? And there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. There's a lot of different ways to be a Buddhist. So I kind of want to explore those tonight. That's what we're going to be talking about, right? And I'm going to actually do something, which is I'm going to actually keep doing this, which is that I've just fallen into this pattern of talking about the three divisions of Buddhism: Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, right? This idea of the morality, the meditation, and the wisdom. I've been really enjoying like spending a little bit of time talking about the Shila, the discipline aspect of this, and talking about the meditation and talking about the wisdom. So let's start by talking about Shila, this idea of like, again, morality, ethics, discipline. Well, this is definitely an area that I think kind of makes one a Buddhist or not in a certain way. And what I mean by that is that like insofar as Buddhism is a religion, the religious aspect of Buddhism is very much in this Shila. It's in the moral discipline. And I say that because what I'm specifically kind of referring to right now, it's the idea of taking precepts or taking vows, taking refuge at just a more broad category. And so the idea is that a Buddhist in that way is somebody who has either taken refuge, taken the precepts, taken vows, or all of those in a certain way. So let's talk about that. So the most general category that I've mentioned is the idea of taking refuge. So taking refuge is probably the most broad, general way of being a Buddhist. And actually, the talk tonight, I'm going to this is really what I'm interested in talking about tonight. So let me tell you about it. I'm really interested in talking about like institutionalized or like organizational Buddhism and like what it means to be involved in a Buddhist organization. But I want to kind of contrast that by kind of in a way talking about my own path, which is that I am not part of any organization. I have not taken refuge in an official way, right? But I consider myself a Buddhist and a Buddhist teacher and all of that. So I kind of want to share organizational institutional Buddhism and then sort of more individual, personal, private Buddhism. At an organizational level, you could take refuge in a very formal, official way. We're talking where there's a ceremony, right? You might even be doing it alongside other people. There would be an officiant. There would be somebody who oversees the ritual. There is a public declaration of taking refuge in the Buddha, taking refuge in the Dharma, and taking refuge in the Sangha. So that would be sort of the most broad, general way of being a Buddhist at an organizational level is taking refuge. Now, normally in a Buddhist organization, if you take refuge, you are normally at the same time agreeing to observe precepts. And I've mainly talked about the main 5 precepts: the precept against killing, stealing, lying, intoxication, and sexual misconduct. Those are the big 5 precepts. There's little longer lists for lay people, but those are the big 5. So at an organizational level, you would take refuge, and also at that time take precepts. And if you were a lay person, then you are now like on your way. You might get a Dharma name, a new like an official Dharma name. That's a very normal thing to happen in the world of Buddhism. It doesn't happen in every Buddhist organization, but it happens in many of them. Especially with lay people. Lay people don't always get Dharma names, but in some organizations they do. So there's taking refuge, taking precepts. Then, of course, we need to talk about the divide between being a lay person and being a renunciant, being a monastic. At an organizational level, it all begins though with taking refuge and taking the main five precepts. And then if you go all the way with being a monastic, then at a certain point, you would take all 250 precepts. Now, those 200, and the exact number changes from group to group, but in general, for a fully ordained Buddhist monk or nun, there's roughly 250 precepts. Now, another thing that I want to share tonight or talk about is if you were interested in doing that, then in taking the 250 precepts, what you are doing is well, you are now engaged in a relationship with something called the Vinaya and or it's called the Pratimoksha. So the Pratimoksha is the actual list of all 250 rules. The Vinaya are these records, many, 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 multiple volumes of records of the occasion of when the Buddha made that a rule. So, in other words, if you're taking all 250 precepts, which are part of this thing called the Pratimoksha, if at any point you wanted to know, why is that a rule? Like, why are we not supposed to do that? You could go study the Vinaya, the texts of the Vinaya, and learn exactly why the Buddha made that a rule. Okay, so all of that. Oh, and of course, if you were a monastic, upon taking the precepts, you would shave your head. You might shave actually all the hair of your body, depending upon the sect, because some Buddhist sects shave everything. Other Buddhist sects just shave the head. You would take a vow of celibacy, the vow of poverty, get your monastic robes, your begging bowl, and you're on your way. So there's being involved in a Buddhist organization, and each Buddhist organization uses, I don't want to make it sound like they all use different Vinayas and Pratimokshas. There's basically like three, maybe four different versions of the Vinaya slash Pratimoksha rules. So, like the Zen schools and basically most of the Chinese schools use the Dharma-guptaka Vinaya. The Dharma-guptakas were a very specific sect of early Buddhists. Their Vinaya is what is used in East Asia. There's other Vinayas that are used in Tibet and other Vinayas that are used in Southeast Asia. But they're all pretty similar in that way. Okay, so you could sign up with an organization, take refuge, take precepts, and now you are officially a Buddhist in that way. But then you might just want to practice Buddhism. You might not want to you might not want to get involved in an organization like I didn't. I didn't want to get involved in an organization in that way. So at that point, what we're looking at is like, well, what does it mean to be a Buddhist in that sense? Well, in terms of Shila, it means not killing, not stealing, not lying, basically not drinking, and being very careful with your sexual energy in that way. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that to be a Buddhist, at least at the level of Shila, it's about those five things in particular. that those five, like the tendency towards violence, out of control desire, right? Delusional deception. So greed, anger, delusion, right? Or anger, greed, delusion, killing, stealing, lying. And then this crazy world of alcohol and sexuality, where those two things are very volatile, very kind of powerful in a way. So the Buddha basically was like, be careful with those. So for me, a Buddhist is somebody that is mindful of their relationship with those five things. And you don't necessarily have to be part of an organization to do that. Okay. Anything come up for anybody? Questions, comments, ideas, insights, realizations? Anything regarding Shila, being a Buddhist, not being a Buddhist? I meant to mention this weeks ago, and I keep also missing the opportunity, so I want to mention it right now. So, in the world of like full on Buddhism, like full on Mahayana Buddhism. So we're talking like a Zen traditions, Tibetan traditions, um, so all of that world of Buddhism. There's actually sort of like potentially, actually, let me use I'm gonna talk specifically about Tibetan Buddhism right now. So if you were to get involved in the Tibet A, because there are multiple, so if you were to get involved in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there would actually be three levels of Shila, or three levels of precepts. The first level is the Pratimoksha. So the primary rules that we've just been talking about, that we're always talking about. But what's interesting though, and there's one particular place or one particular point of interest. And what it is, it's that in the original form of Buddhism, in the original Pratimoksha, there are no rules regarding vegetarianism. So actually, in the original form of Buddhism, they were not vegetarian. In the original form of Buddhism, you were supposed to beg for food and you begged for leftovers. And whatever people gave you, you were grateful to get. And if it was meat, there was a particular like, oh, good, it won't go to waste. Because that would be terrible if an animal lost its life and the food went to waste. So in the early form of Buddhism, they were beggars getting leftovers, and it didn't matter. There was only one major rule regarding that. The animal couldn't be killed for your benefit. It had to be leftovers from some other situation. So that, because otherwise you're just going to start having people slaughter animals to give as offerings to the holy monks, and we don't want that. So the original rule was just leftovers only. But in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, that kind of became a little bit of a sticking point or a little bit of a problem. And that's because the Bodhisattva path is so deep on the rescuing and saving of all sentient beings. So what happens is that in the mainstream Mahayana traditions, they add a layer of precepts, and they're known as the Bodhisattva precepts. There's a sutra. It's a Mahayana Buddhist sutra known as Brahma's, the Brahma's Net Sutra. And in this sutra, the Buddha lists 48 bodhisattva vows. Of those 48 bodhisattva vows, one of them is about being vegetarian. So what I like to kind of like relay to people is that I know that Buddhism is often like associated with vegetarianism, and most Buddhists are vegetarian, but in the Mahayana tradition. In the Theravada tradition of the Southeast Asia, they're mostly vegetarian, but again, there's exceptions in terms of begging. So you get your first layer, the old school original Pratimoksha, a Mahayana layer of the Bodhisattva precepts, and then in specifically in the Tibetan style of Buddhism, there is a third layer of what is known as the Vajra precepts. It's a class, it's a category of precepts. These are even other precepts. A lot of them have to do with like multiple lifetime vows in that way. But my whole point is that depending upon the specific Buddhist organization you get involved with, you will have different levels of precepts. And that'll have a lot to do with whether you're a lay person or a renunciant, and then whether you're part of a Theravada tradition, Mahayana, or Vajrayana. Okay, that kind of covers all the Shila. Shall we move on to the meditation? Move on to Samadhi? Yeah. Okay. So, the one thing, just real quick, when it comes to studying or learning about Shila, our go-to place is the Vinaya, right? That body of literature, that body of scripture, that's what's kind of underneath morality or the Shila. As we move to the category of meditation or Samadhi, there's a little bit of information in the sutras, for sure. So sutras are going to be a source of information for how to do meditation. But there's another category of text that we usually call a shastra, a commentary. And in it's at that level where it's not the words of the Buddha, but it's commentary, people commenting on what the Buddha said. For example, in the Theravada tradition, there's a very, very famous book called the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification. And it's a pretty detailed meditation guidebook as it pertains to that early Theravada style of Buddhism. And the reason why they kind of needed a guidebook to meditation is because the Buddha doesn't actually talk. I want to be very clear about this. The Buddha talks a lot about meditation, like all the time. But he actually doesn't give a lot of instructions exactly. Like he kind of just says to do it. And there's a presumption that everybody that he was talking to knew already how to do it. And so that when he said, yeah, go to a secluded place, you know what to do. They presumably did know what to do. But as time went on, people were like, wait, what are we supposed to do in the secluded forest? So you get a commentary tradition that kind of fills in a lot of gaps. So, in other words, in terms of doing Buddhist meditation, you could study the sutras, but you're probably going to wind up studying this more kind of secondary material in that way. So that's where you would go to find the information for meditation. Then there's the idea that being a Buddhist means you're a meditator. That's like one, or what I would say is a kind of defining characteristic of a Buddhist in that way. First defining characteristic, if you ask me, some relationship with the five precepts. Like if you're not working in some way with the five precepts, you might just be a meditator or something. But to actually be involved in working on those five precepts, that I think makes one a Buddhist in that way, whether it's at an organizational level or just private personal practice. In terms of meditation, I would say that a Buddhist is somebody who has a meditation practice. But let me clarify, I do not exactly necessarily mean a cross-legged 30 minutes a day meditation practice. It might look like that. Like it might be a formal sesshin type of Zen, where you're doing it on a daily basis at a specific time in a specific place. Sure. But I'm actually kind of referring to meditation as non-reactivity. So, in other words, like many of us, myself included, many times today, frankly, lose it in a certain sense, like get overwhelmed by things. And maybe we say stupid things that we shouldn't say, or whatever it is. Whereas, so just doing whatever, saying whatever, come what may, that's that. But to actually try to be on top of your own mind, to actually try to stay calm in the face of opposition. That's what I mean by a meditation practice. Now, it can become formal at times, right? Where you actually go on retreat, or you go to a meditation center, or I don't know, you use an app or watch a video and you're like actually kind of meditating. Yes, that's good. But I want to throw in there meditation as just being the practice of trying to stay calm all the time in that sense. Now, when it comes to doing meditation, when it comes to samadhi as a aspect of Buddhism, that practice can be formalized and be part of an organizational structure. So what I mean is that just like with Shila, oh, actually, I forgot to say something about Shila. Yeah, this is important. So sorry, we're just going to take a quick step back. In terms of the precepts and in terms of um, an earnest following of the precepts, it can really help to have a support group. So in other words, the organization, like a Buddhist, I don't know, if you go to a Buddhist temple, you go to a Buddhist monastery, you go to a Buddhist church, or whatever it is, the idea is that a sangha, a Buddhist community, can be very, very, very helpful for upholding your practice of morality, right? It's like, again, it's like a support group for that. Now, some people don't need a support group. Some people are fine just following the precepts on their own. Great. But not all of us have such stamina in that way, and it's helpful to have a support group to either be like, keep going, you can do it, or to hold you accountable, or whatever it is. So, joining a Buddhist organization to be a support network for your moral discipline could be good. Same thing with meditation. Some of us are fine going off alone and meditating. Some of us don't need instruction in that way. Others do better with a support network in that sense. And again, in terms of maybe accountability, in terms of showing up and doing it, whatever it is. So, my feeling is that to be a Buddhist means you are engaged in some way with a meditation practice, but that is defined in all kinds of ways. And that in as far as you're working on that meditation practice, you might seek an organization to help you with that, or you might just do it on your own. Now, if you're going to do it on your own, if you're going to do morality, if you're going to do the Shila all on your own, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't drink, and watch your sexual energy. That's the practice. Good luck. If you're going to meditate on your own, I would strongly encourage sort of a studying of the sutras, a studying of what the Buddha said regarding meditation. And I think the one piece of it's not exactly advice, maybe it's guidance, a little bit of guidance that I would give anybody. It's it's what the Buddha says regarding meditation, or like regarding in particular the first jhana, the first really deep meditative state, that first dhyana. The Buddha calls that first deep meditative state, uh, or he describes it, I should say, as the joy of seclusion. Now, when he describes it sounds like it's like Thoreau on Walden Pond, right? It's the joy of removing oneself from society, removing oneself from all of the madness, right? But it's for me, the joy of seclusion is not just about sequestering yourself in private. It's like my main Dharma teaching. And it's this Dharma teaching about joy that comes from things versus a joy that comes from independence of things. That's my understanding of the joy of seclusion. And the idea is that if you're kind of bouncing from one sensual pleasure to the next, if you're like, this is really good. Oh, this isn't really good anymore. It's not giving me joy anymore. What else have you got? Ooh, that'll do. Give me this. Ooh, this is pleasurable. This is getting old. What else have you got? If you keep jumping from external sensual pleasure to external sensual pleasure, you'll you'll never get to the joy of independence. Like you'll never taste it. You're just going to be jumping from one external taste to the next. And so the idea is that it's tricky at first, but that seclusion, which for some is boredom, right? For some, it's a waste of time. For all of these ideas is actually what you are up against in that way. The idea of boredom, yeah, if you meditate and you get bored, it's the conditioned mind that wants another goodie, that's conditioned to need another goodie. And the idea is that if you can stick with a good meditation practice, if you can eventually taste that joy of seclusion, in a way, you won't even want any more external goodies because you'll realize, oh, those aren't real pleasure. The real pleasure is from not needing anything. So the mantra in that sense is this idea of the joy of seclusion or the joy of independence. All right. Yeah, so since I really want to get to the good question, really interesting question, let's move on to the third category of things. So we're moving on to the wisdom. So again, this is the prajna, right? This transcendent wisdom, right? Prajnana. It's like beyond jnana, it's beyond knowledge. So this is our third category. Um, as I've been kind of doing this on Sunday nights, I keep kind of reminding everybody that these three categories of the teachings, they support each other in that way. And what I mean is that like a good meditation practice supports your following of the precepts. A good meditation practice supports your understanding of all of this, your understanding of the teachings of the Buddha. But the more you understand the teachings, the more you'll want to meditate, the more you'll want to be morally good in that way. So they all kind of support each other. And then in terms of pranya, the primary source of information, of course, is the sutras. And if you want to go really deep, the best place of information for pranya are the Pranya Sutras, Heart Sutra, Vajra Sutra in particular. So the reason why those two sutras, the Vajra Sutra and the Heart Sutra, the reason why those are so celebrated is because they are express routes to pranya. And so, insofar as the third category is about developing this wisdom, those are two sutras that expedite that realization. So, studying sutras is going to be key for developing this kind of wisdom. Certainly, there are Buddhist organizations where you could go in that way to learn the wisdom in that sense. What what I kind of want to basically say is that within a religious context, this third category, the pranya, this is what we would call the dogma, the doctrine. The I mean, it's not theology, it's technically it's Buddhology. And there is such a discipline as Buddhology, by the way. But the point is that, if morality is about like rules and meditation is this interesting psychophysical calming practice, pranya is about like the teachings, again, the doctrine in that way. So what I kind of am trying to get around to, if you go back to the Shila, I mentioned that there is this very, very popular Dharma Guptaka Vinaya. The Dharma Guptakas were an old school original form of Hinayana Buddhism. Yet, the Dharma Guptaka Vinaya is the basis of almost all of Mahayana and even some of Vajrayana Buddhism. So, in other words, what I'm getting at is that in terms of Shila, except for the vegetarianism thing, there's not a lot of difference in terms of this Buddhist school, this Buddhist school, this Buddhist school, this Buddhist school. They all mostly use the same Vinaya. The only difference is that in some of the Mahayana schools, they add bodhisattva vows. And then in the Vajrayana, the Tibetan traditions, they add Vajra precepts. But underneath it all, it's the same classic Buddhist morality. So, in terms of Shila, there's not a lot of difference between the different schools of Buddhism. It's not like there's some weird school of Buddhism that's like, oh, yeah, go ahead and kill, go ahead and steal. No, they're all telling you that these are the precepts. Okay, so In terms of the Shila, there's not actually much difference between the schools. When it comes to the meditation practice, there is difference, but at the end of the meditation session, there's actually not much difference. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of different like Buddhist techniques, little upaya, little methods for doing meditation, and different schools have different methods. For example, in the Tibetan tradition, they use visual aids, these things known as mandalas. They don't use mandalas in Southeast Asia. They don't use mandalas in the Zen schools. But the point of staring at a mandala is the same point as observing your breath. It's the same point as observing a candle flame. So, in other words, the goal of all of these different forms of Buddhist meditation, the goal is the same, but what makes different schools is slightly different techniques in that way. But when we come over to the pranya, and Diane, I see your hand, I'm getting there. When we come over to the pranya, which again, I said is sort of like the dogma or the doctrine, this is really where you're going to start to see differences between the different schools or sects of Buddhism in that way. So, Diane, sorry that took so long.
Oh, no, thank you. And I want to, but first of all, I salute you. Thank you for presenting things this way because I was really, as a young person, when I first embraced Buddhism, I was so put off by the status thing. And I have a transmission, and, I'm part of the baby boom. So it was all the me decade. And I want to be the top dog and all of this and have the right color, the right little whatever. So thank you. I was just kind of wondering, and maybe you're getting there is like what the paramitas and the Eightfold Path. Is that so? We're in that realm now. Is that what the
Yep,
in the prajna
yep,
realm?
yep.
Okay. Yeah, and I just love how you're presenting this because I feel like I'm a Buddhist. I believe I am a Buddhist because I follow the teachings of the Buddha. And then and then in just this, I just happened to be at a Thich Nhat Hanh retreat and he gave precepts. And then I just happened to be at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I was like in a big stadium, right? And all of a sudden he goes, if anyone would like to take precepts. So it was like, hey, bonus, you know.
There you go. That's how it happens. Um, yes, indeed. So we are now talking about this wisdom. Indeed, we are talking about sort of well, actually, Diane mentioned like the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is actually sort of there's aspects of the Eightfold Path that are Shila, there's aspects of the Eightfold Path that are Samadhi meditation, and there's aspects of the Eightfold Path that are about pranya. So the Eightfold Path is sort of like, you know, the basic steps of Buddhism, how to get to enlightenment, and they embody these three categories of teachings. So, specifically, though, in terms of pranya, the wisdom, we're talking more specifically about like the philosophy, for lack of a better term, like the teachings of emptiness. That's what's going on over here. The teachings of either impermanence or the teachings of no self. That's going on over here in terms of pranya. The main thing, or one of the main things I want to mention, is that Buddhist organizations, like all religions in that way, but Buddhist organizations, of course, are the keepers of the knowledge. They're the keepers of the wisdom. And so, if you are a Buddhist and you are developing your pranya, one way to do that is to get involved with a Buddhist organization and to then begin studying what they're teaching in that way. Every Buddhist monastery I've ever been to has a university or a seminary attached to it, and that's where you would go to learn the wisdom if you were getting involved in it as at an organizational level. Now, if you're doing it the solo route, right? You're doing it just all on your own. Then my recommendation to you is to study. That's what it would mean to develop prajna. Read the sutras, read the shastras, listen to Dharma talks, and study. That would be developing prajna in that way. Come to Sunday night at SFDC in that way. So, okay, so that's what we're talking about. And I want to now address, Robin had a really important question, and it fits right into thinking about prajna, thinking about wisdom. So, and Robin, jump in if I, as usual, if I mangle this, but the question was sort of about the world, and I think I can understand where uh, I feel like I can understand where Robin's question's coming from these days, given the state of the world. And the question was regarding a sort of, well, she didn't say it, but I will, a sort of Christian notion of a heaven on earth with the idea of, so is there a notion in Buddhism that if everybody got their act together and everybody got on the bodhisattva path and everybody really did the practice, is there an idea that it would turn the world into a kind of heaven on earth? Is that the gist of the question, Robin? That kind of general notion? Great question of serious, serious concern. And it's a good, I think it's a good opportunity for me to like mention something about Buddhism and its philosophy. So the first thing that as soon as I read, Robin, as soon as I read your question, it was like, oh yeah, we definitely need to talk about this because there's a very interesting thing going on here. And it's a way of thinking. And what it is it's this idea of the world. And what I mean is we have like a notion or an idea of the world. And I'm talking like 8 billion people, not to mention all of the animals and bugs and creatures and the planet. And so we have this notion of the world. But from a Buddhist point of view, I would want to take a step back and look at that notion of the world. And specifically, what I'm kind of thinking about is nobody ever sees the world. From a Buddhist point of view, we are always smack dab in the middle of experience. And we never, in that sense, move outside of being right in the middle of experience. But Robin, when you mention this idea of the world, that is the idea of like, and allow me to introduce some language here, some technical language, but that introduces this idea of the objective world. And from a Buddhist point of view, that's already a little suspicious. Okay. So, what I kind of want to get around to is we kind of, yeah, I really want to spend the rest of the evening kind of pulling apart and dissecting the difference between a theology of creation versus Buddhism. And what I mean is that in the Judeo-Christian Islamic world, it is very easy to think of and talk about the world because it's very much a part of the Judeo-Christian Islamic theology that there's a God that created the world. What I'm getting around to in a not and I need to get there quicker than later. In the Judeo-Christian Islamic view of the world, time is linear. And what I mean is that in the Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview, there's one timeline, and it starts at the beginning of creation. The world got created, and we are presently in the middle of it. It's happening. And in the Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview, this is all going to end at some point. And then you will have time, the beginning of time and the end of time. Whereas, as a general, just a default mode way of thinking, in India, creation is cyclical. There have been so many Earths. There have been so many versions of this. And what that does is it creates a tremendously different worldview regarding the world and time. And what I mean is that when there's only one world and it was created, maybe 6,000 years ago, and there's just one world, that leads to certain ways of thinking. Whereas if you're in this like cyclical mode where, oh, this is all going to just come right back around again, it's just going to come right back around again, that immediately changes everything. So that's the first thing I want to mention is this difference between the Judeo-Christian Islamic theosophy, I think it's called, like it's the theological story, right? That is that is a worldview. Now, let's go deeper and more clear into the Buddhist idea of this. So the first thing we want to understand is that from the very beginning of Buddhism, like the oldest sutras, the Buddha said that the beginning of the world and the end of the world are unknowable. That they don't even worry about it. So deal with now. Don't worry about the beginning of time and definitely don't worry about the end of time. Worry about right now. Don't worry about right now, frankly. I don't want you worrying, but there's now. Okay, so that's the first thing is that from a Buddhist point of view, there's now, and that's what's important. Now let's go back to what I was saying before, which is that from this Buddhist point of view, you're always right smack dab in the middle of your experience. And so there's a way in which these notions of the world are exactly that. They're sort of just a notion in that way. And so, okay, let me say something very directly, very clearly. In response to Robin, in response to your question, what I would say or suggest, I would suggest that the idea of like the idea of everybody getting their act together and becoming bodhisattvas, and then the world becoming like a better place, the world becoming that's sort of all very, 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 very hypothetical, theoretical. Buddhism wants you to improve your world with the idea that you improving your world will improve the world, but just focus on your world because that's all you can focus on in a way. allow me, I'm going to just put a little parenthetical, something for you to think about. I would suggest thinking about, like, how would actually I put this? I I want to say something. I'm trying to figure out how do I say this? So there's a mentality, right? And this mentality is one that wants to um, remake the entire world in the way that I think it should be. The problem with that is that there's currently people trying to remake the world in the way that they see it. And for you to come along or anybody to come along and say, no, 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 it should be the way that might be just as problematic as the other person. So rather than trying to make the whole world the way you would like it, make your world the way you would like it, because that is actually what you have control over, actually, in that sense. Okay, so that is now going to lead me to talking about, like, oh, it's kind of like about Buddhist, there's many Buddhist efforts out there to try to make the world a better place, right? There's many Buddhist organizations trying to make the world a better place, but it's interesting to look at the way that they're trying to do that. And what I mean is that from everything I've seen from all the Buddhist organizations I've been involved with, they seem to really be trying to change the world one mind at a time. And and indeed that's sort of like I think the only way it gets done in that sense. So again, I know I kind of keep saying the same thing, but it's the idea that maybe worrying about the whole world is not helpful in that sense. If that makes sense, Robin, like in that way. Yeah. On that note, I did want to now mention that Robin's question regarding sort of the world, it immediately made me think of something. And what it is that another thing that I want to do on these Sunday nights, of course, and I did it a little bit tonight, but I do want to kind of share and introduce these different types of Buddhism, like these different styles of Buddhism or schools or sects, however, whatever language you want to use. So, of these many different schools or sects of Buddhism, there's one in particular that I wanted to talk about, and it usually goes by this name of Pure Land Buddhism. It's one that, as far as like, Zen Buddhism might be one of the more popular types of Buddhism that people have heard a lot about. Tibetan style is up there, but then there's this idea of what's called Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism is a very interesting form of Buddhism that I think is really misunderstood in a lot of ways. So first of all, it's a very old form of Buddhism. It definitely goes back to BC, like the BC era for sure. You can even find traces of it in the lifetime of the Buddha, but it's sort of definitely something that seems to have arisen probably a few hundred years after the Buddha passed. And then it becomes very popular in China and Japan. And then today, Japanese Buddhism is dominated by this type of Buddhism. So it is colloquially known as Pure Land Buddhism, but it sort of goes by a few different names depending on where you are. But it gets called a devotional form of Buddhism. And it looks devotional, it feels devotional and all of that, but it has very interesting philosophical origins in that way. So the basic idea, oh, and by the way, there's a lot of different Pure Land Buddhisms. And so I'm giving you a general description of them. But in a general way, interestingly, Pure Land Buddhism is trying to make heaven on earth. It's why Robin's question immediately made me think of it. But it's, of course, not heaven on earth. It's a pure land. Same idea, though. But the idea, though, and by the way, we have like many, many, many Pure Land sutras. And in those Pure Land sutras, there's there's something that happens every now and then, and it gives us an insight into what this kind of Pure Land type of Buddhism is. And what it is that it's the idea. So it comes from the idea that a Buddha, an awakened or an enlightened being, it originates from the idea that a Buddha literally has a kind of a sphere of purification, an, an influential sphere of purification where when the Buddha was alive, if you just got like close enough to him, you could get attain stream entry. I think there's even stories of people becoming arhats just by getting close to the Buddha. So that's the beginning of the idea of what is known as a Buddha Kshetra, a Buddha field. And the language of a Kshetra, a field, it's like a magnetic field, like that kind of a field. So they talk about a Buddha field. Now, originally, this was just a comment on how influential the Buddha was. But then what happens is that the idea of a purified Buddha field or a purified Buddha realm, that starts to become like a concept of a totally pure zone, a totally pure Buddha field. Then this is what happens in some of the sutras. A student, Shariputra in particular, a student will go to the Buddha and say, I thought that because of your influence, because of the Buddha field, I thought that this was supposed to be a purified Buddha realm. But Shariputra says, but everywhere I look, it's just nasty, dirty, terrible. Like everybody's being mean to each other. It's terrible. And Shariputra says, so what's up with your Buddha field? Like, what's up with your Buddha land? And the Buddha basically says, there's nothing wrong with my Buddha land. The problem is with your mind. And it's in those situations that it is revealed that a pure land or a purified Buddha field, it's about how you're looking at it in that way. It's about the level of the purity of the mind itself. So, what happens is, and if you ask me, it's really beautiful, but there's something, and I alluded to it already. I was trying to plant the seeds for this. When we were talking about the idea of the world, and I introduced very quickly, I hope you caught it, but I introduced the idea of the objective world. And what we mean by the objective world is like the world as it really is. Like the object, the world. Now, allow me very quickly, some of you have heard this from me before, but this is a deep level of prajna. So we're still in the prajna category. So a deep insight. Let's take, for example, whatever it might be. Let's use my pencil. So a normal, regular way of thinking. So this is just, regular. But a regular, normal way of thinking would be that we're all here and we're all looking at my pencil. And it might be that for me and my eyes, it might be that this appears to be neon green, right? But for your eyes, it's magenta. And for somebody else's eyes, it might be orange or whatever, right? So the normal way of thinking is that there is an object out here. There is this thing, but each of us is having our own subjective experience of it. So the normal way of thinking is that there is the objective world and 8 billion subjective experiences of that world. All right, so this is just the normal way of thinking, right? That there's really truly a world outside of your mind, but everybody's just kind of looking at it and kind of having their own subjective version of it. All right, that's the normal way of thinking. Well, the Buddha comes along, or Buddhism comes along, and asks some very serious questions about the so-called objective world. The primary question, and by the way, this is the exact same line of inquiry that Immanuel Kant was going off in his Critique of Pure Reason. So if you're into philosophy, if you're into Kant, this is exactly what Kant's talking about. It's the idea that there's an objective world, right? Like beyond my subjective experience. But how do I access it? How do I who gets to see this objective world? Isn't that just their subjective experience then? In other words, well, spoiler alert. Immanuel Kant, based upon Christian theology, has faith and believes that there is an objective world created by God, but he says we puny little humans, yeah, we can't access it. You can only access the real world, the objective world, through faith, says Kant in that way. You know what the Buddha said? The Buddha just said, oh, that's a silly idea. The very idea of an objective world is a silly idea. And so, from a Buddhist point of view, there is not an objective world and 8 billion subjective experiences of it. There's just 8 billion subjective experiences that sort of quasi overlap. And it's how we can communicate with each other, but we are actually all in our own little world. Now, if you're following me on that, if you're following me on my removal of the delusion of an objective world, if you're following me on that, and you're following me on the idea that you are smack dab in the middle of your subjective experience, and there is no other way for this to be, if you're following me on that shift, the shift away from the idea of an objective world sinking deep into what I would call radical subjectivity, then I would say, welcome to your Pure Land. I'd say, welcome to your Buddha land. Get busy purifying it because that's the basic idea of Pure Land Buddhism is that we are all the Buddha of our Buddha world. But if it looks screwed up to you, it's an indication of how defiled the mind is in that way. And so purifying the mind purifies your Buddha land, and then you will eventually become a enlightened Buddha, and your Buddha land will be totally purified. If you ask me, all of that Pure Land Buddhism that I just laid out for you, it's just a very beautiful way of describing the exact same project of Buddhism in terms of clearing up the mind. They just put it in the language of a purified Buddha land. And the idea is that if you're into that kind of more mystical, wild type of thinking, Buddhism has a track for you in that way. But if you don't want to get involved in all of that craziness, you can just join a Zen monastery and meditate with your nose 2 inches from the wall. And it doesn't require any mystical, wild thinking about Pure Land Buddhism. So, okay. Questions, comments, answers, ideas, anything regarding those ideas about the world, ideas about meditation, or ideas about Shila morality? Maria?
So, I've been thinking about a lot how you've said that, you know, this idea of prana is beyond duality. And so that means beyond, self and other, this and that, here and there. And so I sort of have a little koan that came to me. In the unity of opposites is freedom found. And so I've just been chewing on that for a few days now. And it's like, it makes my mind just kind of, what? Yeah. And so I feel like that's good. That's a good, that's a good thing. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Excellent. Indeed. That is pranya. That is the practice. That is the exercise. Yep. Diane?
Well, I think of my practice of Buddhism as it's mind training, and I'm training to unwind all this constructing and all this expectate all of these patterns and processes in like it's like I have software that's just it's not helping. And then but isn't there sort of a notion, or I guess I had an insight once that, I save myself, I save everybody.
That's that is the message tonight, especially regarding this idea of like you want to save the whole world, save yourself.
See, I love that because it's all about, it seems like in the Western European tradition, which is the one I know the best, well, the one I'm living in, it's there's one who knows, and then and it's just, so I like how, and I love the idea too that I don't have to be an official Buddhist,
Yeah.
again, and have, oh, I don't want a black robe, I want a brown robe, and oh, a Dharma transmission from that one isn't as good as this one, and just like, why bother, you know? Anyway, just thank you. I just love these classes, and this is
Oh,
so
good.
wonderful and helpful.
Oh,
And yes, study and practice. It's that's My thing is as a balance of study and then practice, because you can go to all these teachings, but you've got to, the important thing is find and there's so many different ways too. So just anyway, thank you for
ah,
this.
my pleasure, Diane. By the way, on that note, Diane said something that reminded me of something Maria just said, so throw it out. In terms of finding that unity of opposites in the way that Maria just said, here's a little something to think about, or just a kind of a final statement tonight. I had mentioned, of course, that there's this classic divide in the world of Buddhism between being a householder and being a monastic or a renunciant. And and part of the Bodhisattva path is actually like contemplating the middle path of neither, neither a householder nor a monastic. Just try that one on for size in that way, but do it in such a way that you're not falling into either category in that way. Like truly see if you can find that middle path between being a so-called householder or a so-called renunciant. It's a little koan in that way, right? All right, everybody, let's call it a night. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it so much. Great to see everybody. I will be back next Sunday. I hope you will too. In the meantime, if you have any questions, just let me know or let SFDC know and they'll let me know. And then I'll see you next Sunday night.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My
Thank you
great
so much,
pleasure.
Michael. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.